Tsunami. In the distant future, in the year 2050, the city of Rio de Janeiro shone like a beacon of modernity and culture. The streets were vibrant, the shopping malls were packed with shoppers, and the bars, always full, echoed with laughter and music. It was an ordinary afternoon for the locals, one of those sunny days that made Rio one of the most beloved destinations in the world. However, there was a tension in the air, an almost palpable uneasiness that hung over the city. In recent weeks, newspapers, radio stations, and television stations had been talking about nothing else. Meteorologists and climate experts had been warning incessantly about an unprecedented storm approaching the Brazilian coast. The winds, estimated at 100 kilometers per hour, brought with them an invisible and silent threat, a tsunami of catastrophic proportions. But, as is common in large cities, many ignored the warnings. Rio had faced storms before, and confidence in the city's resilience was unshakable. At 3 o'clock on that fateful Friday afternoon, the sky began to darken. The sun, which had been shining brightly just minutes before, was swallowed up by rapidly forming black clouds, a harbinger of what was to come. People on the beaches looked curiously to the horizon, some with cameras in hand to capture what seemed to be an abrupt change in the weather. The winds began to blow harder, ripping off umbrellas and scattering sand across the boardwalks. The temperature suddenly dropped, and daylight turned into an eerie darkness. In the city center, traffic lights flickered, and traffic came to a standstill as drivers tried to make sense of what was happening. Pedestrians huddled under awnings and inside stores, watching in amazement as what seemed to be the beginning of an early evening. Inside the shopping malls, the atmosphere changed from a cheerful buzz to a nervous murmur. Lights flickered, and a sense of dread began to set in among those present. Then, without warning, the sea began to recede. It was a sign few recognized, but those on the beach knew something was terribly wrong. The normally choppy waters of the Atlantic suddenly became calm, before being sucked out into the distance in a scene that defied all logic. Lifeguards, sensing the danger, began shouting for people to run to higher ground, but for many it was already too late. Suddenly, like a roar of 1,000 thunders, the tsunami appeared on the horizon. A wall of water, as tall as a skyscraper, was hurtling toward the city at terrifying speed. The waves swallowed everything in their path, sweeping away the beaches, the promenade, and the buildings near the shore in seconds. Cars were tossed around like toys, and trees were ripped from the ground like twigs. In the city center, panic set in. People ran desperately through the streets, seeking refuge wherever they could find. But the tsunami was relentless. In a matter of minutes, the waters invaded the avenues, rising to the first floors of the buildings. Windows burst under the pressure, and the sea invaded shops, offices, and apartments, destroying everything in its path. The following minutes seemed like an eternity. The roar of the waters was deafening, and the screams of people trying to escape mixed in a chorus of terror. Some clung to posts and trees, while others were swept away by the violent waters. In the South Zone, the famous neighborhood of Copacabana was practically wiped off the map, its streets transformed into raging rivers. People tried to climb onto the roofs of cars, balconies of buildings, anything that might offer a chance of survival. Inside one of the many buildings on the waterfront, Helena, a young medical student, watched everything with wide eyes. She lived on the 10th floor, and for a moment she thought she was safe. But as the water rose, her hope diminished. The building shook with the force of the waves, and she knew she had to get to the rooftop, the only place where she might be able to survive. Gathering her courage, she ran through the flooded hallways, climbing the top floors amid the chaos. When she finally reached the top, panting and soaking wet, she found dozens of other residents, all silent, watching the devastation below. On the other side of town, in one of the many communities that spread across the hills, Carlos, a construction worker who had finished his shift early due to storm warnings, watched the city being consumed by the water. His house, a simple makeshift building, was on high ground, but he knew that many of his friends who worked downtown would not be as lucky. He tried to call his wife, who was in a hospital downtown, but the phone lines were already down. The helplessness and it felt suffocating, and he could barely breathe as he watched the city sink. For 40 minutes, the city of Rio de Janeiro was subjected to unimaginable destruction. The waves destroyed everything in their path, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Helicopters flew over the city, trying to rescue the survivors who managed to take shelter on the rooftops. But the fury of nature seemed relentless. and the city that had once shone like a jewel in the Atlantic was now submerged in a sea of destruction. When the tsunami finally receded, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake, the sun began to reappear on the horizon. It was a macabre sunset, dyed red by blood and destruction. The streets, once full of life, were now deserted and covered in debris. Bodies were swept away by the currents, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the roar of the waves themselves. Helena, still on the terrace of her building, looked around in shock. The city she knew was unrecognizable, a field of rubble where there had once been life and movement. She could not comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. In the distance, she saw the statue of Christ the Redeemer, which miraculously still stood, a silent symbol of resistance amidst the chaos. Carlos, for his part, came down from the hill and began walking towards the center, trying to find his wife. He passed through streets covered in mud and debris, where there had once been life. Each step was heavy, but he knew he had to keep going. He had to find the woman he loved, even if it meant facing the worst of realities. As the sun set, survivors began to emerge from their shelters, each with a story of loss and survival. Rio de Janeiro, a city accustomed to storms and challenges, was now facing its greatest ordeal. The reconstruction would be long and painful, and the scars of that day would remain forever in the memories of its inhabitants. In the days that followed, the city struggled to get back on its feet. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, and solidarity among Rio residents proved stronger than ever. But the memories of the 2050 tsunami would never be erased. The roar of the waters, the cries of despair, and the deadly silence that followed forever marked the soul of the city. Helena, Carlos, and many other survivors would continue their lives, but always with the memory of that dark and terrible day. Rio de Janeiro, which had always been a symbol of joy and celebration, now bore the weight of an unspeakable tragedy. The city had survived, but it would never be the same again. And as the sun set over the sea, Rio remembered, with each sunset, the day the tsunami came and changed everything.